My name is Ruth Morrow. I'm Professor of Biological Architecture at Newcastle University in the north of England. I once taught at Sheffield quite a long time ago. In fact, it's 20 years. I started at Newcastle on the 1st of January 2020, and I began in Sheffield on the 1st of January 2000. So it's exactly a 20-year gap between Sheffield and my new post at Newcastle. But it was also, Sheffield was also my very first permanent post. So prior to that, I had been working in academia since, I think, 1993, 94. I'd sort of been part-time tutor. I'd started in that role, doing 1 day a week or 2 days a week. And then I'd gradually got involved. I was teaching at Dundee and kind of an amalgamation of different contracts. And then I ended up on a research project at UCD in Dublin. So, but, those are short-term contracts. Sheffield was the very first permanent contract as an academic. It took me a long time to admit, even so, that I was ever an academic. So I always thought that I was still an architect until maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. I thought I have to really embrace this title of being an academic. But yeah, so Sheffield was from 2000. Very short time, actually, when I was there. I was only there for 3 years before leaving to take up a professorship post at Ulster University in Northern Ireland, which is where I come from. You can hear that in my accent. So it was a very short time at Sheffield. It was also a time when I had my first child. So believe it or not, I had 7 weeks maternity leave. Still can't quite believe, but I had 7 weeks off during those 3 years. And but it was a really seminal time, and I still regard Sheffield as kind of being the place from which most of my thinking has evolved. And certainly it remains a community that I return to, and a lot of my colleagues in Sheffield are still people I hold very dear, very close. And some of them have moved on, and I'm now very fortunate that 2 of them are now working alongside me, or I'm working alongside them at Newcastle. So it feels as if I'm kind of back in the family somehow by taking up my role at Newcastle. Yeah, so a very important part of my life, very, very important staging post moment to really reflect on what I was there to do. So how do you perceive a feminist approach of Sheffield? I can't call it SSoA, but I'll call it Sheffield at the time you were working there between 2000 and 2003. So, as I say, prior to going to Sheffield, I had worked at Dundee, and I was very fortunate to be part of a women's group at Dundee. It was a women's reading group that then also turned into a women's dance group. And I was also involved in a research project at Dundee, led by an amazing woman called Gerda Cyan. She's a professor of gender studies when I was there. So I definitely knew and had read fairly extensively around feminism prior to going to Sheffield. And I didn't go to Sheffield thinking that it was a feminist school per se. I went there because I'd met Jeremy Till and was very impressed by him, thought he was a very forward-thinking individual. And he really encouraged me to apply, and I felt that the process of application, where I also gave a lecture at the time and I met different people, at the end when they offered me the job, it felt as if not only did I want to go there, but they wanted me to go there. And that is actually relatively rare. You don't always get that sense in interviews or presentations that people are actually interested in you. They just look at you as a kind of another member of staff who might bring in revenue or whatever. But I did feel as if I was going to a place that wanted me. So that was kind of the first part. As I say, I didn't realize it was a feminist school, but I very quickly worked that one out. Not so much that people declared themselves as feminists, but that there was an extraordinary amount of females. So in my time at Sheffield, or at Dundee, for example, I was, I think, one of 2 women on the staff, and we were all both young, pretty marginalised in decision making. But in Sheffield, there were senior women, Sarah Wigglesworth, obviously, and Prue, and then along came Doina Petrescu, and I think that kind of amalgamation of women, and the fact that Jeremy was clearly a declared feminist, made us, I think, charged and excited, and confident enough to declare the feminist school. I mean, I probably would never have said that in any other place, and subsequently have never said that. So in Sheffield was really the only place where I felt confident to be a feminist. Subsequently, I've worked in places where, if you declare yourself a feminist, you're open to tirades and people accusing you instantaneously of discriminating against men, and of course I'm an inclusive feminist, as I think all the people I interacted with at Sheffield were. We believe that feminism isn't just about women, it's about the liberation of all people, and so it's very much about justice and equality, not just for women, but for all people. And I really truly hold to that belief. I think feminism does a great service for men as much as it does for women. So I think Sheffield was definitely a place of community and a place for me to be confident in that way of thinking. So in the time that I was at Sheffield, I was part of a group. I mean, they invited me or asked me, and I willingly accepted the challenge of looking at the first year course. And so I think for the first couple of months, because it was, so I joined in January. For that first bit, I was in the first year course and was just observing it. And then by the time it came around to the September, I sort of took over the running of the course. We looked to employ different people to come into the course. And over the remaining time I was at Sheffield, that pedagogy built and built. And I think it was an incredibly intense time. We had large amounts of students to teach. So I think there's probably over 130 in total. That was across both the pure architecture course, including also there was an architecture and landscape course. And then just at that time as well, they just started a new course, which is a combination of architecture and engineering. Really amazing, bright students. Amazing people came through that course, I have to say, but it meant that you were managing those three courses and large amounts of people. And of course, I kind of saw that was the way architectural education was going, because we were increasingly, taking in more and more people. That was following kind of government initiatives to open universities to a broader sector of people, a broader scope of people, which of course politically I would definitely agree with. But it did mean huge challenges, and architectural education has, for years been premised on the one-to-one tutorial. As a woman studying, I felt I often felt that was real power based. I mean, I was on the receiving end of that, where we would be really regularly patronized by tutors using that kind of power and in that way of kind of close proximity. So I was never a firm believer in it, and I've always felt that the students have as much to say as the staff. We are all witnesses and we're all in the built environment. We all have opinions about that, and those are all valid. So one-to-one tutoring was something I was quite happy to see the demise of when it came to the large cohorts. It's not to say that I don't think there's a time and a place, but it has to be a very specific time, and it isn't just something that you throw at a student, but it's something that is, it's a very specific tool to use, but it isn't obligatory or shouldn't be a default or any of those things. So I was kind of thinking about this, a large amount of people coming in, also people from very different backgrounds that previously had been at university. and at the same time thinking how we could make more effective pedagogies. And a lot of that is to do with trying to get the students to be just much more reflective. So giving them the time and the space to do a project, and then we talk about it at the end. And I think probably that was the most significant thing of what we were doing. Is to a certain extent, some of the projects were fairly normal or normative, but at the end we were kind of really spending time to think about what does this project mean to you as an individual, and what does this project mean to architecture. What is the impact? Is this relevant to architecture? Because a lot of projects you get as a student, you sort of do them and not really know what the relevance is. Why are people making you do these kind of weird things? So it was very much about that reflection. I think that's one of the, teach less, talk more sort of thing that was really important. But the studio built towards a thing called Building Clouds, Drifting Walls. And we, as a group, we put in an application or into an award system. We won a pot of money from the university who recognised what we were trying to do. And that money went into capturing the teaching in a little booklet called Building Clouds, Drifting Walls, which was designed by some of the master's students at the time, who I think both of those people are now fully embedded in teaching as well. So I think that's a real marker that people would also be inspired to be teachers, not just practitioners. To be a practitioner is great, but I think to really get people wanting to be a teacher of architecture, I think is quite something. So Building Clouds was, as I said, this kind of series of pedagogical events. And it became more and more refined across the time. It wasn't deliberately or overtly a feminist pedagogy, but I did reflect on it a few years after I left. At the same time, I was also involved in feminist discussions across the school, and there was a feminist week that occurred within Sheffield at the time. Which I'll talk about maybe as well, which I thought that was a fantastic thing to do. But yeah, I suppose, and I was also kind of giving lectures about gender. Jeremy ran a lecture course and Sarah taught on it, and they asked me to give a few lectures as part of it as well. So it was a real collaborative kind of sense. And so me kind of actively reflecting on feminism and then also teaching meant that the course was, I suppose, imbued with that kind of outlook. And as I say, a couple of years later, Doina published a book called Altering Practices, Feminist Politics and Poetics of Space. And I wrote a little short chapter that kind of really went again and looked at this body of work and put it within a kind of feminist framing. And I started to read this little chapter last night whenever I was getting ready to talk. And I thought some of it is still amazingly fresh. It's embarrassing to read stuff that you wrote so many years ago, because some of it can be so naive and unpolished. But I mean, the freshness of it still stands, and I still really stand by that piece of work. And I think all of those people who were involved in teaching it, and I'm thinking of Adam Cowley and Dan Jarry and Jane Anderson and a whole range of people who have then subsequently gone on and done their own kind of teaching at other institutions. That I think was important for them, but it was equally important. I mean, there were also students. We got students to write as part of that. Apologies for the little noises. Yeah, so I just thought it might be worth talking about some of those things because they were so significant and they have definitely influenced me, and surprisingly so as I've gone on. You sometimes don't often look back enough over your shoulder to work out where you've come from. But there was one piece of work so we started the year, and I think this is really important. We started the year by allowing students to work in groups and design a little house for themselves. And of course, that's absolutely the last project you would get students of architecture to do. I come through a kind of system that believed that you brought students of architecture in through the door and you kind of wiped them clean of their really bad taste bad, poor experiences of architecture, and then you built them back up again as proper architects. And I didn't really see the point of doing that. I also thought it was really important for us to give people the opportunity to come in day one and do what they expected to do, which was to design a house. It makes them feel, oh yes, I've joined the right course, because there's always that bit right at the very beginning where they kind of don't, oh, I don't know if this is the right place. They're asking me to do these really weird things that don't feel relevant. I don't understand their relevance. And so we just did the really obvious thing. At the end of it, though, the point was not, I mean, there was 2 points. One is for us to know them better, to see the struggles that they would have in a group, and also to see what they understood architecture to be. So there was quite a long reflection on the models that they produced. But alongside of that, we also asked them to come into a room and together create a curriculum for architecture. So using post-it notes, they would write down, we need to learn this, and we need to learn this, and together they kind of made the curriculum. They had history and theory, and they had professional practice, and and they reordered it, and they just made the curriculum. So that's a lot easier for them then to come in and to see this curriculum that we give them. It makes sense, they relate to it, they understand. It also gives us an opportunity to say, individually you might not come up with it, but look, collectively you know enough to put together a curriculum of architecture, and that's in the first week of studying architecture. So that was me saying, collectively you know this stuff, so before you ask us, ask each other, because that you're here to learn in community, you're here to be part of that community, and you'll probably learn as much from one another as you will from us as individuals. So that was me putting it back on them. That was me saying, we can't teach each individually, but we can get you all to reflect together, and there's enough knowledge within you to that we trust that. But it also, interestingly, gives an opportunity to look at what are the gaps, because there are inevitably gaps when you make that curriculum. And one of them, there's 3 that emerged over, I think I only wrote about 2 in the thing, but there's 3 that emerge. One is money. So students rarely think about, how do we need to know the cost of these things? I think that is something that pervades the profession as a whole. And then there is another one around people. So, and again, I think this pervades the profession in that we tend to think if we are one, we know them. So we talked a little bit about the necessity to understand other people's views, and the fact that, I'd also been working on things like inclusive design and come out of disability studies. And I was very aware that, architecture is critiqued because we tend to design in our own image, and if that image is a very limited one, it just makes it very difficult. And then the third one is that they rarely, in fact, I don't think they ever said about we need to learn how to design. And again, I think that's something that I've pursued all of my career, is there's this belief that design is kind of comes through the sky and comes down, and you're either a good designer or you're not. So students feel that insecurity, and indeed architects feel that insecurity. And actually design is a practice. It's very innate in some moments, because it relies on a set of values that are fairly deep down within us, to do with aesthetics. But you can, of course, bring that out. That's what happens in other design disciplines. And of course, you can teach design, or you can maybe not teach it, but you can certainly get students to reflect on their own design and their own aesthetics and what drives them. So, so that was interesting that people think, somehow design is given to through osmosis. Very significant. I'll talk about one other project which I think makes a difference, which is a project called Designers, Kings and Assemblers. It's a 2-week project, And this project stays with me, not least because I think the title is a really good one, um, but also because it's kind of driven quite a lot of my own research in terms of material practice. So in week one, it looks like a very standard architecture project where students are asked to design something that they themselves need from cardboard. So they know that they're going to have to build it in cardboard. And they do a set of drawings. So they design something and then they do a set of construction drawings, essentially. Week two, those drawings are handed over to someone else in the year, and they receive a set of drawings. So they change from being designer to assembler. And in the start of that week, they can only construct from those drawings. We give them an opportunity to maybe meet midweek and talk to the designer about, is this the right way of doing it? But otherwise, they're kind of then assessing the designer's ability to do drawings that are effective. It exposes a lot, of course, that project. And at the end of it, we then talk about who is the king in this process. Is it the designer or is it the assembler? And that is a heated debate. And of course, never to be resolved, because who can resolve that? But it does expose the fact that there is, again, a kind of assumed hierarchy that the designer will tell the tradesperson how to do it. And but in actual fact, what we need to do is to draw on that experience and expertise of the tradesperson and deliver. And for the most part, people said when they were assembler, they liked being given a space that allowed them to make decisions and to improve the design. And I really like that notion that the person who's actually making has an expertise that the designer could never really have. No matter how accurately they draw the things, no matter how clever they are, there's still always going to be a point at which the assembler needs to kind of take ownership. And it's been something that, again, goes all the way through my career, which is, the line that we draw is not owned just by us. It is also owned by those people who may actually make the line. So to claim ownership over a building as a signature name, I find very weird. So, and it kind of picks really at the foundation stones of architecture to some extent. So that notion that that kind of hierarchy is a kind of falsehood, really, and really has no place. So, of course, the students, there are examples of the students who work long hours to produce highly accurate step-by-step drawings that allow neither for alteration nor error on behalf of the assembler. This approach frequently works, and the final product is just as the designer imagined it to be. But we then discuss the cost of this approach, the long hours, the low wages, and an overly controlled process that negates the expertise and creative potential of others. So even in first year, we're able to talk and open that conversation about, okay, so what happens if you are super controlling, and what happens if you are super talented? At a certain point, you're actually doing the work that others could still do better. And you do it at your cost. So that's kind of about, I talk about that in terms of this kind of feminism as being facilitating and not always controlling. And when I wrote the chapter, I was always saying, so non-hierarchical, not always hierarchical, fluid, not always fixed. So it isn't setting up this kind of dichotomy between, this feminist and a non-feminist approach. It's saying that this is an inclusive, that we can be both fixed, but also fluid. We can be controlling, but we should also think to be facilitating. And I think that's probably, the closest that feminism comes to a diktat is to be, we have to be inclusive, doesn't work unless we're inclusive. Memories of working at Sheffield and the feminist work that went on there. And I think my overriding memory is collaborative and discursive and being in community and being given a confidence by my peers, which I'd never really, never really had, and probably lost as well when I left. Because it's fantastic to be surrounded by people who are all kind of thinking and moving in the same direction. You know, subsequently when I left Sheffield, I went back into a world where there weren't that many women, certainly not many women at senior level either, and certainly no heads of school who had a declared feminist position like Jeremy had. And I think that kind of confidence, it definitely relies on community. Otherwise, it just becomes a kind of bolshiness, which is not really that useful. But yeah, so there's kind of collaborative thing. But during the time that I was there, it was decided that we would have a feminist school. And I can't actually remember how long it lasted. It felt to me as if it was the whole time. But I do think it was just a week. And in that week, lots of women were invited to come into the school and to be present. And there was lots of activities and kind of this sort of typical thing that you do, you get together collectively, you cook and you eat and, you make proposals and, just the kind of school is slightly disrupted, but in a very pleasant and social way. But I suppose the one thing that, if I have a really acute memory, is of Stephen Walker brushing the staircase in the Arts Tower in Sheffield. So Stephen Walker was at that time, I think he was relatively new to the school. He was a lecturer. I mean, I think he's gone on, his career's got, he's a stellar academic, brilliant writer, brilliant researcher, and a very thoughtful individual. And Stephen was one of the few men to get involved in the feminist school. And his action was simply to take a brush. He invited us all to come into the stairwell in the Arts Tower, which is a pretty manky stairwell it was in those days. And it was always full of those kind of little dust varmint or balls that would float around the staircase. And what was interesting was at the time I had got quite friendly with the cleaning staff. It's really important anyway to be friendly and to work together with those people who kind of service the spaces that you're in. So whenever you're looking after a large cohort of students, obviously the cleaners, it's really important to be on the right side and to work with them, because they have huge challenges. So one of the cleaning staff had told me that in NVQs, they are taught to brush towards themselves. So they don't brush away as you would if you're at home in your own yard or your own kitchen, but they're taught to brush towards them. And that's so that the contamination is not spread. I mean, I did point out to that woman at the time that it meant that she was continually contaminating herself. So this NVQ was very cognizant of other people, but not of the cleaning staff themselves. And that thought really struck me, that somehow these women were locked into looking after everybody else, but actually putting their own health at risk. And Stephen then, there's quite a large crowd gathered in the staircase, and Stephen then very, very calmly, very quietly just brushed the stairs and brushed around people's feet. And I find it really moving. Still do, if I think about it, because I think it's an incredibly thoughtful act, especially to do it around people's feet and to just be mindful of people being there. And I began to understand that people cleaning our environment were, ultimately the kind of the bottom of the ladder, and they put themselves in that kind of negative position. It's not so nice to be a cleaner, I would imagine, and the health implications of that. And then I thought it was a really great thing for a man to do that, more than anything. And, throughout my career, anytime that I see a man making an effort to do something like that, to really imagine what it is to be in a woman's shoes, to show that level of empathy, You know, I just think that's an amazing thing, you know, it's a wonderful thing. So of all the things I witnessed, probably that is the most poignant. Yeah. So after all that, so how a future feminist school of architecture will look like, or will look like, let's be positive. Yeah, I mean, I would say the very first response to that is that a feminist school will be super diverse. And by that, I don't just mean male and female. I mean diversity of women and diversity of men and all the genders in between. And I think diversity is also about diversity of expression. So not just what one looks like, but also how one is allowed to express oneself or given the place to express. So I think expression is really fundamental, and it kind of goes to, I mean, I mentioned it earlier on, a kind of reference to aesthetics, but here I'm going to go back to it. So in the subsequent years, I've been researching and thinking. I have started to work, I mean, I've just written a piece that kind of combines pedagogy and improvisational theory. And I've become interested in improvisational theory because it's a way for me to understand socially engaged practice and to frame that in a slightly different way than or to get at it through a reframing through using theory. And what is brilliant about improvisation is that it is a deeply inherently social act. So when you come into improvisation with others, I mean, it's playful, but it's also respectful. So you have to respect that others are going to do it differently. And improvisations in music, at least, and drama, are you're not just allowing people a space to express, but you're also reacting to their expression. And gradually what happens is that there is another dynamic, another aesthetic that evolves. So there's yours that comes out and is being seen by others, and other people reacted, and they are, you know, and then gradually there's kind of a shared aesthetic, or maybe, I don't know if it's shared aesthetic, but it's definitely, you know, a range of aesthetics that are produced within that moment. And interestingly, in improvisational theory, they talk a lot about improvisation as being a route towards justice, which is quite a difficult concept to get your head around, because you mostly just think of improvisation about being around music and, as I say, being playful and open, and likewise for drama. But the argument goes that if you're in a place, so the argument is that aesthetics is part of our value system. So we have aesthetics, ethics, and politics. Politics is obviously a societal value or shared amongst groups, and ethics can be aligned to an individual or a group again, but it's usually fairly overt. You know, we can be parts of ethical movements and whatever. But aesthetics is the one value that is really, really deep within us. And but it kind of shows, it's an indication of our background, our own values, our culture, you know, who we hang about with, all of those things, but it's still a kind of hidden expression of us. And for the most part, especially when we're under attack or when we're undervalued, we hide that probably the most. So you don't want to, you know, express your aesthetics too much in case someone takes umbrage with it, and then it becomes a real personal attack on you. And yet at the same time, the more one understands the aesthetics of the other, the more one starts to accept others, and you can see that richness evolve. And I think one of the things I've always found very depressing in schools of architecture is the end of year show, when I go around and I just see little mini me's, you know, people drawing in the style of their tutors or people drawing in the style of the school. And I think, what a missed opportunity for 7 years of study to end up simply copying the aesthetics of others. Now, I don't put the blame on the student. I put the blame on the system that doesn't allow the individual to express themselves aesthetically. Now, when you first start that process, that often results in ugly, lumpy things. You know, architecture is ugly and lumpy. And I think what happens is that a lot of practitioners or teachers will come in and try and save that by giving students, oh, why don't you have a look at this precedent or have a look at that precedent? And of course, that's a natural thing to do, but I think you can't save it. You have to allow the expression to come out in the first bit in order for the students to gradually refine their aesthetic over the time that they're there, for sure. So I think a feminist school would let that happen. A feminist school would allow lumpy, bumpy, ugly pieces of architecture to evolve in order for the students to gradually find their own voice and come to voice. And so I think at the end of it, you know, you would see it very clearly at the end of the year that actually this was a school super diverse, because the drawings and the models and the installations would be random, you know, and to some extent maybe incoherent, and but yet it was fundamentally about the individual. So I think that's probably an indicator of feminist school. Yeah, that's probably the best I can get to.